everyone from Abu Dhabi. It's very, very wonderful to have once again the yin and yang, the salt and pepper of Williams and Jensen, Chris Wilcox, and Matt Hoekstra to give us the Inside the Beltway post-election edition of what's going on the Hill. So I know we will have some very spirited questions and answers in chat. So please keep yourself mute while the gentlemen speak and just shoot your questions to me in the chat box, or you can raise your hand when the presentation is over. We are looking for the spirited conversations we always have with our friends here at Williams and Jensen, and we are recording it so that you can become YouTube stars at the end of the day. So next slide, please. So Chris and Matthew have been with us, Chris and Matt have been with us for a number of years with Williams and Jensen. And I just want to give a shout out to our friends at AmChams, Israel and Bahrain. As you know, the Abraham Accords is something we're working very diligently with here in the UAE, and we're thrilled to have them join us today. There are not too many slides. That's it. We'll just go to gallery view, and I will throw the floor to Chris and Matt. Let's see who goes first today. It's all yours, guys. Over. Who wants to start? Winner or non-winner?
Chris?
Oh.
Let's go with Chris.
Your Honor. All right. Thank you very much, Liz, for that that wonderful introduction. Normally, Matt and I would be sitting very, very close together trying to get onto one webcam. So I guess maybe a sliver of a silver lining to the predicament that we all find ourselves in this year. That I got at least some shoulder room and don't have to brush up against Matt's beard during our discussion here. So, but we're happy to be with you. We want to talk about some of the high-level takeaways. I think you've probably all seen the election results, or most of the election results that we've had by this point. But I think that having this discussion now allows us to talk about some of the high-level takeaways from the races that have already been decided, and we will probably have, I think, a little bit of speculation about those that haven't. The presidential race does not fall into that category, in my view, but Matt may have some more insights as to that. But we have, I believe, 2 outstanding House races and 2 outstanding Senate races right now. The Senate races will both be contested on January 5th in the state of Georgia. I presume you've probably heard a lot of discussion of those on the international media. You probably haven't heard as much discussion about the 2 outstanding House races, one in Iowa and one in New York State. Both of them separated by less than 15 votes at this point. I think the one in Iowa is 6, and the one in New York is 12, and depending on which campaign you talk to, that 12 differs. And there was a ruling in that case today where the judge ruled that 55 affidavit ballots that were discovered untime stamped in a drawer in one of the 10 counties in that district in a desk would be counted. So we'll see. Those ballots were cast by people that showed up on election day and weren't on the rolls for whatever reason. Allegedly. Usually only one way to get affidavit ballots, other than the judge did rule that there was no outright fraud in that this afternoon. So that case, that race is going to go on for a while. And is there a date? The Iowa one is a runoff, correct, Matt?
No. So the Iowa one is actually the state of Iowa has certified. So the states here certify the election results, and then even for federal races, and then those members generally get seated. It's all but always happens that once the state certifies the result of each election, then the member gets seated with the new Congress. But because Iowa is so close, and as Chris said, separated by 6 votes, the Republican is ahead 6 votes, but the Democrat in the race has said she plans to go to the House Administration Committee and challenge the seating of her opponent, basically contest the election and say that her opponent should not be seated and sworn in as a member of Congress until the House Administration Committee, which is in charge of elections, looks into that. And of course, House members are in charge of seating their own members. So even though it generally is an automatic process, the Democrat in this case has the right to make this request. So I think that the options have been exhausted in Iowa, but not necessarily at the federal level.
And that appealing to the House Administration Committee is an old Republican trick, as I learned recently when I was watching SNL reruns on an episode that Phil Hartman was hosting, in which Linda Sanchez was ultimately seated. I don't think the appeal went very well in that case either for the Republican in that race that she defeated, who appealed to the House Administration Committee when Republicans were in the majority back in the 90s.
And Chris, and stranger, but stranger things have happened too. In the last cycle, there was a very odd election in North Carolina, and it was a similar situation, although they didn't have to appeal to the House. Although Pelosi had said quite bluntly, this person would not be seated if they were certified. But the state of North Carolina did not certify the winner because of some fraud that was discovered on behalf of the Republican candidate. And the race was so close, they actually ordered a new race. Yeah. So they had a brand new race happen in Q1 of 2019, which happened to be won by Republicans, which was fairly surprising considering the first one was so close, and then there was fraud, and then they were able to win the do-over, so to speak. But anything can happen when a race is that close.
Right. And it's pretty remarkable just how close a couple of these races have become. I think we've obviously not talked about high-level takeaways as promised up to this point, and mostly just random historical trivia to be. I would say that the high-level takeaways, I mean, we know that the House majority, the Democrats' majority in the House has narrowed significantly. I would say that the big takeaway from this race was that there was a pretty strong narrative in the media going into the election that said that 2016 was President Trump's high watermark, and that it would be very difficult for the president to grow and expand his base of support. And I would say that one of the big takeaways from the election is that was completely disproven. President Trump ended up with more than 1 million net votes more than he had in 2016, which means no matter how you dice it, 1 million more people went into the polling place and said 4 more years that didn't vote for him last time or didn't vote at all. And from the Democratic side, that's something that they weren't expecting. And the end result of that is a lot of those House districts that Democrats had picked up in districts that Trump had carried in 2016, that Democrats picked up then in 2018 when Democratic enthusiasm and voter participation was surging. A lot of those races were a lot closer than they thought, and Republicans ended up capturing a number of them as a result. But I think when you go back and you dig through the data, it turns out that those Democratic candidates that were elected in 2018 in those districts also got more votes than they got in 2018. It's just that overall participation and votes cast this time around was historic. And we saw both presidential candidates each get more votes than any other U.S. presidential candidate in history. So
Chris is right. And one other key takeaway, I think, when you're analyzing the presidential results is, you might have thought, based on the news coverage leading up to the election and Trump's 4 years in office, you might have thought that, his base, would continue to be, the white kind of working class voters and others that were, really formed his base in 2016. And in fact, one thing that was surprising, although exit polls are notoriously, a little bit unreliable, especially when you get deep into the crosstabs, But one thing that, does seem fairly clear looking at the election results is that President Trump increased his support among non-white voters. So, primarily among Hispanics, you saw the biggest rise in support, particularly Hispanic men. But you also saw, a more modest increase with African-American, mostly men as well. So that was certainly an interesting trend to see. And it'll be interesting to see, if that's the start of a more of a realignment where, Biden was able to win back a lot of the suburban white voters that Trump captured in 2016, and Trump made inroads elsewhere.
Yeah. And I think one of the narratives that we saw and one of the hot take reactions in that first few days after the election was a contrast, an apparent contrast that people were trying to wrap their heads around about how could Biden improve so much on Clinton's performance and Democrats in the House lose so many seats. And I think it's important that to put that in perspective and kind of help unpack that is that Biden was starting from essentially the low point of Clinton's 2016 performance, whereas Democrats in the House, there were only 3 seats that Clinton didn't carry the district of remaining in the House that were in Republican control. And all of those seats had been in Republican control prior to 2016. So it wasn't like Trump had carried those 3 districts. Democrats just haven't been able to unseat those members who've now been around for 4 Congresses. And at the same time, Biden was able to win back a whole bunch of electoral map where the House members essentially had already captured a lot of that ground and kind of gone beyond and maybe the outer limits of where they could sustain that support level. And so when the overall turnout rose in such great degrees, you saw what appeared to be a contrast, but was actually just more of a recalibration. And Biden had a much more favorable position as a starting point.
And, I think as we start to look at, some of the down ballot races, I mean, one certainly very interesting trend was, a lot of people had predicted that, either Trump would win and the Senate would stay Republican, or Trump would lose and the Senate would flip. And of course, what we saw was a more split ticket performance than we've seen in recent history in elections here. And not only did the Republicans have an edge in the Senate, as Chris said, it's 50-48. And if Democrats manage to win both of those runoffs in Georgia, they will in fact have control of the Senate because Vice President-elect Kamala Harris would be the tie-breaking vote. But if Republicans do win at least one out of the 2 races in Georgia, they will have held the Senate despite a pretty challenging map, not the worst map that either party has ever faced, but a challenging one nonetheless. And they are poised to have a thin Senate majority. And as Chris said, one of the most shocking takeaways from election night for many of us was how many seats that Democrats lost in the House. I mean, that was it's an inexact science to certainly look at some of these congressional districts and project that out to 435. So people have been wrong about the House before, but this was not a map where people thought Republicans would pick up 5 seats and they picked up 15. This was actually quite the opposite, where many people thought, including many Republican pollsters and strategists, thought Republicans would lose 10 to 15 seats. And in fact, they net gained, really 13 or 14 or 15 seats, depending on how these last couple races play out. So why, that's so important to us and to you is that, this is not just divided government legislating, which we've had for 34 out of the last 50 years. We've had divided government here. This is the closest margins of divided government legislating. So, it's razor thin in the Senate. It's razor thin in the House. and certainly some of the more ambitious things that people talk about when they're candidates for president, and Vice President Biden was no exception to that. A lot of the things that would be accomplished legislatively, quite frankly, are off the table until 2022 or beyond. If it's done legislatively, it'll have to be a compromise. And if it's done otherwise, it has to be done through an executive order or through some other type of presidential powers, which of course is very relevant to all of you as well, because as Trump did in his last 2 years with a Democratic controlled House, it really is, presidents tend to focus a lot more on international issues and things that they can accomplish, in terms of their international agenda, because the president has a lot of powers that are a bit unchecked in Congress. So you see presidential powers with respect to trade deals and negotiating the Abraham Accords and things like that. President Obama and the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, you have these opportunities for international diplomacy, which is something that certainly based on his record and experience, Vice President Biden was interested in doing anyway, as a former chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. But now the confluence of things that happened on election night and post-election are also driving Democrats towards more of that type of policy making anyways.
Before we pivot full force into agenda and outlook, Matt, do you care to speak at all to what we can expect in terms of the Georgia runoff, and would you be so bold as to make a prediction?
Yeah, I suppose I will be so bold as to make a prediction. I think if you look at the polling right now, and we have just under a month left to January 5th, both races are fairly close. You have two Republican incumbents, although one is more of a traditional incumbent, Senator David Perdue, who's been in the seat since 2014. So he's been there 6 years, a full term. The other quote unquote incumbent is somebody that was appointed to the seat, Senator Loeffler, Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed to the seat last year. So she's had about a year in office, so much less time. Her first vote in the Senate, in fact, was to acquit President Trump on the impeachment charge brought in the Senate. So it's certainly very interesting. I think when you look at the divide, you also have differences in some of the other aspects. So one thing that people are certainly focused on is there's one race that features a woman, Senator Loeffler, versus an African American man, Raphael Warnock. And then the other race features a more establishment white senator
Male
versus
Republican.
a male Republican senator versus a very young 33-year-old, more progressive, kind of progressive young rising star, perhaps in the Democratic Party. So the races are definitely different. I think that the tendency or the groupthink is to kind of put them both together and say, Republicans will pull both out or they'll lose both. But the only caution I would give to that is when we're talking about two close races, and I think they both have the potential to be close, that 1% of people pulling the lever for Senator Loeffler for whatever reason and not Senator Perdue, or for Ossoff and not Warnock, that 1% or 2% can make a difference. And we saw from this last election that split ticket voting is a real phenomenon, even in 2020, when we have a very partisan electorate. So with that kind of lead in.
Well, if I could just give the counter argument to that.
Okay.
Which is
before I make my prediction.
Yeah, before you make your prediction, I'll make my counter to that argument is I think that they will. My prediction would be that they are going to both go the same way. And while Matt's certainly right that that ticket splitting was seen in the general election, it was much more prevalent outside of the Bible Belt and the Southeast or the SEC, depending on how you group that part of the country. We saw ticket splitting, for instance, in Maine, where Senator Susan Collins, Republican, was reelected, and the state overwhelmingly went for Biden. We saw the same thing in Colorado, and so, or not Colorado. I'm sorry. There's another example in the Midwest. Was it Iowa, Matt, where Joni Ernst?
Ernst won, but
Ernst won, and Biden, I believe, carried the state.
No.
Okay.
Maine.
Maine is the only one.
So
okay.
Maine.
Well, you told me it was widespread ticket splitting. So thanks for proving my point.
No. There were differences. There were certainly, there not too widespread. Maine was the best example. Although, if you look at Georgia, Biden carried Georgia, and Purdue finished first in the and almost avoided a runoff. So Georgia was essentially a ticket split. And then North Carolina and some of these other races were close to being won. Arizona as well.
Correct. Okay. So, but my point for Georgia and thing to watch, and the reason I think they'll both go together, is that both parties here have enough votes to win. These races were incredibly close. Biden carried the entire state. Georgia's been historically a Republican stronghold. And I really do think that it is going to come down to who can get their voters to the polls. Those polls open for early voting on Monday, this coming Monday, which would be Sunday in UAE, I've learned. But on the 14th of December. And will be open through the 5th. And so it's going to come down to turnout, and there's going to be, I think, increasing concern and scrutiny by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party on President-elect Biden to announce cabinet picks that are going to motivate his base and the Democratic base in Georgia, and give them a rallying cry for why they need their voters to come out and deliver President-elect Biden control of the Senate to potentially confirm some of those potential nominees. And I think on the other hand, there's going to be, and you already have seen some hand wringing. I don't know if this is just the media making hay, or whether there is legitimate concern within Republican circles that some sort of final days tantrum by the president, or a refusal to sign government funding bills, et cetera, could have a negative impact on Republican turnout, more so than any of his claims of widespread election fraud and elections being rigged and things like that. So
yeah, and I agree with that last point. And I think to kind of I think to summarize where I am, because I think Chris brought up some very good points there on both sides. I think one thing when we look at is somebody going to are Republican voters and voters that supported Trump essentially going to sabotage these two seats by doing things like writing in President Trump for one of the Senate seats, or not voting because they believe that the president's convictions that the election was rigged. And the write-in thing is interesting because you actually, if you look at the sample ballots across Georgia, you can't write in because it's a runoff. So you're actually not allowed to write in President Trump. You can not fill out your ballot, but you can't have a write-in vote counted. But I do think that that's a little bit exaggerated. I think there's some concern, but I think that the idea that Republicans won't vote, especially the true conservative base won't vote, I think it's going to be fairly limited. And the last time Georgia had a special election runoff for a Senate seat was in 2008. And the Republican finished ahead 49-47 on election night and won the runoff 57-42. So quite a spread. And my prediction this time is it will be much less of a spread. I think both races will be close. And if you were to ask me to make a prediction today, I would say that that Purdue wins 52-48, and that Loeffler wins by less than that, maybe 50.5 to 49.5. But I think they're very close races. I think ultimately Republicans win both of them because the motivating factor of so many of these Democrats we saw in this last election, the record number, was to come out and beat Trump and to vote against Trump and for Biden. And while there is, certainly a motivation for many of those voters to give Biden a majority that he can work with, I just think the majority, I think that passion to come out and vote against Trump isn't going to be there at the end of the day. So I do think the turnout will be high for a special election runoff, but I think Republicans will be able to turn out just enough voters as well on the message of, divided government and running against socialism and higher taxes and no guns and some of those messages that work in a lot of places in Georgia. And I think they'll be able to pull them out and have a narrow 52 to 48 majority.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think we've given several and many scenarios in which a narrow margin could go either way. And so
Absolutely.
My prediction is they're both going to go the same way. I can't tell you whether Democratic fatigue is going to be the narrative after 4 years of Trump and one very exhaustive 2020 or any of the other factors that we've mentioned here. So, but I think that, the one thing, and I see a lot of back and forth in the comments section here about whether or not there can be any bipartisanship. And I will say that in the midst of all of this finger pointing and election challenging and litigation and vote counting that's been going on, there actually has been, since Thanksgiving, quite a degree of comedy, COMITY, and bipartisanship on display in the Congress. And there is a can get done attitude that you would have expected in a normal year coming to the end of a presidency and or a changeover from one Congress to the next at the end of a 2-year cycle. And there's certainly high anticipation for what may be possible in a lame duck session, even though we're now like 3/4 of the way through it, with none of those big ticket items having been passed yet, or even when only one of them having had an agreement that's resulted in text that's passed at least one of the houses so far, meaning the defense authorization bill that passed the House earlier today, and is expected to pass the Senate tomorrow. But again, the major question that hangs over all of this is, even if agreement can be found on a number of things, will the president threaten to veto, somehow tip over the apple cart of all of this holiday cheer that is currently flowing on Capitol Hill, where we're talking about passing an Army Corps Water Resources Development Authorization bill that ought to be passed every 2 years and is up for finishing and could get across the finish line this week as well. We're looking at trying to wrap up a full year omnibus appropriations agreement to fund the government through the remainder of the fiscal year, rather than just another short-term bill that would kick the can into next year. Either of those outcomes is possible at this point. I think there's still a strong degree of commitment on both sides to see if a spending deal on typical government operations, normal government operations, can come together. And then if that's the case, what can potentially join on? Will there be additional COVID response and recovery funding that gets added on to the regular appropriation cycle? Will there be any number of other issues that could potentially be attached, in which we can do some old-fashioned congressional log rolling and I'll trade you your bill for my bill and we can get everything done here. So Matt, I don't know if there's any, are there issues there that you'd like to highlight or?
Yeah, no, I think I think you framed it well, Chris. And I think, one person said in the group chat, hope springs eternal on some of these items in the lame duck. And I actually am in that place as well. I'm still in that place. Maybe I'm delusional. But I do think we get national defense authorization passed in the lame duck. And then I do also think that we will get a skinny stimulus package with perhaps some actual assistance, some additional stimulus checks for Americans, probably less than the first round, but maybe something in the magnitude of $600 per American. And then I think you'll also get the assistance for small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program. I think you'll get unemployment benefits extended, and I do think that there'll be some other, as Chris said, at the end of the day, once they do get an agreement in principle around the general framework of things, and that might require them to drop the liability protections that Republicans want for businesses during COVID. It might require Democrats to drop what they're asking for in terms of state and local government aid. But once they do get whatever they can agree upon in principle, then you're going to start seeing, well, this bill is really bipartisan, and let's add this. It would make it more popular to vote for this, so let's add this on. And I think we will see a few things like that, and we'll be following closely to see what those things are. So I'm a little bit optimistic headed into 2021. But I do think that whatever passes is going to be inadequate and small. And I do think that that President-elect Biden is absolutely right that more will need to be done in Q1 of 2021. And that will certainly be a big and challenging task, especially if they do pass some COVID relief. I think it will make Republicans even have less of an appetite to cut a big deal in Q1 of 2021, which Vice President Biden will certainly be looking for. Chris, do you mind if we go through a couple of these questions here quickly?
Not at all.
Okay. And we'll do like a lightning round on some of these just because they're so good.
Yeah.
And then Chris and I can both kind of tackle some of these. So starting more from the top here, governing by executive order, mitigates the need to compromise where Republicans in Congress and the Biden administration find common ground to legislate. I do think more governing by executive order is in order for the next 2 years. I just think, that was a trend. I'm not going to blame Democrats or Republicans, but every successive presidential administration seems to do it even more. And it's not just governing by executive order. That's not fair because, like I said before, you can do a lot of things with foreign policy and trade without executive order. Those are presidential powers that you can negotiate treaties, that you can do certain things like that. So I wouldn't call that an executive order or an overreach of presidential authority. But I do think on issues like healthcare, on drug pricing, on some of these other things, Trump did one thing, and Biden's going to want to do something different. And in some cases, like drug pricing, maybe Biden will actually try to build upon what Trump did, because what Trump did is not necessarily anathema to the Democratic message on drug pricing. So I think there'll be some aspects, and that's another question I see farther down, that Biden will actually maybe grow and expand and make even more aggressive some of President Trump's executive orders. Other executive orders that Trump did, like an executive order banning balance billing, which is sending somebody a bill in the mail after they think the insurance has already covered what they owe on a medical procedure, and then somebody gets hit with an additional bill, the balance of the bill, that the insurer and the hospital and the provider, the physician, couldn't agree upon the final charge. And a lot of people agree that we should get rid of that. But President Trump's executive order, quite frankly, didn't do anything. So Vice President Biden will either have to issue a different executive order that has more teeth, or that's a type of issue that has some common ground where they can do something on that. So maybe like dreamers when it comes to immigration, maybe surprise billing, maybe some of these issues that President Biden will be motivated to find common ground on, maybe infrastructure in a more limited way. But I do think that a lot of what will happen over the next 2 years of consequence will be via executive order.
Right. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there won't be gridlock in Congress on a lot of those big ticket items, even healthcare, where I think everyone has a shared goal of expanding coverage and getting more people covered. There is, even within the Democratic Party alone, a wide degree of disagreement. Matt mentioned surprise billing. That actually doesn't break down as a partisan issue. It just breaks down about whether you like doctors and hospitals or insurance companies more. And so that's actually been one of the things that stymied the presence of that legislation. But if there's one thing that every red-blooded or blue-blooded American can agree on in the Congress and with the incoming Biden administration, is that we need to stand up to China. And so I think you'll see a lot of willingness from the Biden administration to continue some of the stance of the Trump administration towards China, and also to continue to discuss ways in which America can reshore supply chains and manufacturing for everything from pharmaceuticals to more traditional manufacturing using new and advanced materials and processes, and expand that manufacturing base within the US. And I think that, I think that falls kind of outside of what people typically think about when they think of infrastructure spending. But I think there could be a common ground in Congress of how does the federal government support the reshoring of those industries and the bricks and mortar expansion of the footprint in the United States, or in our nearby allies.
I totally agree with that. I see some questions here about like the F-35s and other things. Should we hold that until towards the end?
Oh, I was gonna say, can I hedge and just say take the under on 50?
Okay, sure.
It was a short question. I thought if we could give it a short answer.
I take the over on 1. I've got the over on 1.
Yeah. All right.
Closest without going over.
Yeah. Although if you guys know a good repo service, there might be a White House person interested in calling.
Well, maybe this is a good segue to something that I'm sure Chris is a lot more prepared to talk about than I am, which is some of President-elect Biden's cabinet. And the one that really comes to mind to me is SecDef, because he's a very interesting pick. It's kind of second straight time we've had a new president pick a general that requires a waiver to serve, because the military, the head of DOD is a civilian position. So he's going to require a waiver. And there's been some grumbling about that. But other than that, I mean, he's a fascinating pick. And one thing about General Lloyd Austin is that Biden picked somebody with his formative experience being in the Middle East. He came up through Iraq and Afghanistan and served in both. And that's really been his area of focus. And I think a lot of people had thought perhaps Biden would pick somebody that was more of an Asia Pacific expert, maybe somebody with expertise in somewhere else in the world. And Biden did pick somebody that knows the Middle East particularly well. Mm-hmm. But maybe that's a good segue, Chris.
And the recent conflict there. I mean,
right.
Being only 4 years retired from being commander of CENTCOM, I think that it's certainly an interesting pick. And perhaps the rationale for it is that we still need to maintain a fairly strong military presence in that region, and Biden is going to rely on more diplomatic outreach in other areas and other regions. certainly, as Matt said, I think that the pivot here in all aspects of foreign policy is going to be much more to a very distinct shift from the current approach, with the possible exception of China, at least in the near term. But I mean, the other cabinet picks that Biden has announced are both interesting. And again, I think I alluded to it at the top here that I think there is going to be increased scrutiny and calculation around picking some of the nominees with an eye towards what the impact might be and how they might be received in the midst of the Georgia Senate race for those that are named here early. There also may be a desire by Biden to hold some picks and not announce as quickly certain nominees that for positions that he may not want to necessarily announce a pick before knowing the outcome of those Senate races in Georgia. Certainly, he's already had a couple of nominees, his budget director and pick of former congressman and current Attorney General of California, Xavier Becerra, to be the head of Health and Human Services, has already drawn fire from conservatives in the Senate that have put down some pretty hard lines about not confirming what they see as two nominees that are far too liberal. And there's already been some, I don't know, chest thumping and grandstanding on both sides about we need more. Biden needs to appoint more people like this from the progressive wing of the party, the Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders wing, as well as from House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, who was largely credited with breathing new life into the Biden campaign in the South Carolina primary, and rallying African-American voters to support Biden in that contest, which, you know, Biden's campaign, I think pretty much everyone would agree was on fumes going into that last week of February. And, you know, on the single strong showing in South Carolina, basically turned everything around. So Clyburn is going to be the chair of the inaugural committee, but don't get your hopes up because he said it will be 80% virtual. Or maybe do get your hopes up. Maybe you guys normally miss inauguration. And now you'll be able to 80% participate, just like the rest of us in these little boxes. So Clyburn has had an outsized role in and been very close to Biden's ear in terms of suggesting who should be picked. And we saw a little bit of hiccups along the way there. Clyburn had been a strong supporter of Ohio Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, who's a member of the House Agriculture Committee. Was the third, now the second ranking Democrat on that committee. Now the third, was the fourth, and would have been the first African-American Secretary of Agriculture. But it was announced a couple of days ago that Biden is going to go with Tom Vilsack, who is a former senator from Iowa. Matt, correct me if I'm wrong.
Iowa and governor. Yep.
Former senator and governor from Iowa, and who served all 8 years of the Obama administration as the ag secretary. Now, if I want to be cynical, perhaps,
You do.
or if I should say, this is all speculation and not based on any inside information, but I think Vilsack is actually a wonderful pick. Obviously, not historic since he's already served in that role previously. I'm not quite sure why someone who's been governor and senator and then ag secretary for 8 years would want to take a 4-year hiatus and return to being a secretary, but perhaps he just has corn in his blood. I think he is a great pick for an agency that isn't so vital and important to the heartland and the Midwest and the Mississippi Delta region, that Biden has picked someone who is seen more as a centrist and not as a liberal firebrand, and who has a record and is a known entity for some of these regions that strongly favored President Trump in 2016, and which have been very, very hard hit by a lot of the trade actions of the Trump administration, and where the economic effects of the pandemic are probably not fully realized yet. So I think that picking someone like Vilsack that has both the experience and is seen as more centrist and can get confirmed probably by the Senate without too much trouble, is a safe pick that signals that Biden intends to govern with an open door and attempt to reach bipartisan compromise, even though that he, as president, will have the prerogative of trying to pick his own cabinet, and will probably run into headwinds with some of the candidates that are selected. So, Janet,
I think what Chris is telling you with Secretary Vilsack is invest in ethanol. That's the ethanol industry would do well.
Yes.
No, I think,
I would never say anything to disparage my fellow Albany Law alum. So,
no, I think one other thing that I think is interesting with some of these picks, and I'll talk about some of the other ones relevant to tax and trade. And I saw a couple of questions on taxes down below. It is an interesting thing in terms of some of the tax positions. So Biden is Assistant Secretary for Tax, who will run tax policy at Treasury, is apparently going to be Lily Batchelder, who used to be a staffer for the Senate Finance Committee on the Democratic side. The U.S. Trade Representative, who I understand is being announced tomorrow. There's a lot of speculation around Catherine Todd, who is the Ways and Means Tax Counsel for the House Democrats. So I think one thing that you see with a lot of these selections is Biden is taking people from Congress. And that's no surprise because Biden is a creature of Washington and of the Senate. He spent so many years there, so many decades there, and that as opposed to some of his predecessors, including President Obama, who he served with. Obama and Trump were certainly relative outsiders who at different times and in different styles really made clear that they didn't necessarily care what Congress thought in a lot of cases. And I think with Biden, you're seeing somebody who very much cares what Congress thinks. He's taking very talented congressional staffers and putting them in tax and trade policy positions. And he's also going to, we expect, work very closely with Democrats in particular in Congress to set policy and to chart out an agenda. So I think when it comes to issues like tax and trade, when we think about it through that prism, on FBAR and FATCA and the taxation of Americans living abroad, you have certainly some very progressive thinkers that will be in the president's administration. Lily Batchelder has a very progressive reputation, and she focuses on individual taxation. That's really her bread and butter. Some previous people who have had that job have focused more on the corporate side. So it will be certainly interesting to see what type of policy she advances. But I don't think anybody would be particularly surprised if there was a lot of interest in closing some quote unquote loopholes in the individual tax side. And I think you'll see a lot of, make sure that, higher income earning taxpayers are paying their fair share. So I think you'll see a lot of that rhetoric. And I think you saw that. That's not inconsistent with what President-elect Biden said on the campaign trail. Now, he did say he didn't want people making less than $400,000 to see their taxes go up. But we've also seen statements like that may have more to do with the brackets and that number than the overall tax rate, which can get tweaked from a lot of different directions. So I think that will be an interesting thing. But I think in terms of Congress, it's more or less the status quo in terms of who the players are. We are going to lose Chairman Grassley is term limited at the Senate Finance Committee from Iowa. So we're going to lose Sharif's dear friend and Iowan and former neighbor, which is very sad for all of us.
Not losing him; he's just going to another committee, man.
Yeah, we didn't. He's not dead. He did have COVID as an 86-year-old, which was very scary. But he made it to the other side and moving to a different committee. But he'll be replaced by Senator Crapo. And it is dependent on Georgia whether he's the chairman or not. But Senator Crapo from Idaho will have similar, I think, policies and approaches as Grassley did. But there'll be some important differences, and he'll be somebody we'll want to make sure to have a dialogue with early on in his chairmanship to talk about these issues. Senator Wyden is not going anywhere on the Democratic side. He's still going to be the lead Democrat on the Finance Committee. And then on Ways and Means, it's total status quo with Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady still holding those top positions. The only thing I would say is not status quo is that now we have a president-elect and a future soon-to-be president in office that cares a lot about working with the Hill. So I think you will see President Biden, Chairman Neal, Speaker Pelosi, Ranking Member Wyden, Leader Schumer talking a lot about their plans on taxes, and a lot of that being Hill-driven rather than a lot of things coming from this Treasury being more Trump-driven.
The only thing I would add to that is that, interestingly enough, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who has been a champion on some of the FATCA issues, was recently this past year taken over and became chairwoman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform in the House, which does also have jurisdiction over the Postal Service, I believe. And so there's a potential to continue our dialogue with her to see which of those international mail issues could potentially be worked on. And I mean, I think we have always seen that FBAR and FATCA issues have kind of been pretty far down in the weeds for some members, particularly because just the amount of turnover in Congress. You have a lot of folks, with the exception of new members like Tom Malinowski of New Jersey, that have been ambassadors and served overseas. You have very few folks that are familiar with a lot of these expat issues. But in a year or in a Congress where big ticket items are not moving, there's potentially time for education and recruitment of new champions. I'm sorry if I sound like the eternal optimist, but I'm surrounded by all this holiday cheer, and Matt's still at the office.
So no, I agree with Chris, and I just saw Kathleen's question on reopening some of the foreign offices of the IRS. I have not heard about that, nor have I asked any questions about it. So we'll put some inquiries out there and see what we can find out on that. It might be a little bit early to figure out exactly. I think that's a little bit of a not a down in the weeds issue, but something that Biden may take his time on a little bit before making any commitments or decisions on that. But I'm glad that Chris brought up Congressman Malinowski from New Jersey, and this is just a random thought, but something that we've been thinking about here a little bit. Congressman Malinowski was in a very close race, and one thing that put him over the top in his election was actually the overseas ballots. That came in his favor, very heavily in his favor at the end. And similar things played out in Georgia and some of the other very close races out there. And it's interesting because people here tend to group together the military, the troop ballots overseas and the other overseas ballots that come in. when in fact, sometimes they're quite different in terms of who they vote for. But that is something that I think has some promise. I'm drinking Chris's optimistic Kool-Aid here, that we can engage with some of these members, because with so many close races and so many people that really are paying attention to where the ballots are coming from, where the votes are. If you were in a razor thin race, which a lot of these House members were this time around, and in the Senate as well, you knew exactly where those overseas ballots were coming from, and you knew if you won them big or lost them big. So I think that's actually an interesting way to continue to engage on issues like FACA and FBAR. And one of the reasons why someone like Carolyn Maloney has made a smart decision to say, I want to be one of the people that focuses on Americans abroad. And I think and hope that more members of Congress will actually start thinking that way, because that thousands of votes coming in at the end of the election can be a very big thing that puts somebody over the top.
So I'm very cognizant of your time, gentlemen, and we're almost on an hour. So shall we go for about another 10 minutes or so? I know it's very late at night for you, but lightning round of thoughts, random thoughts, impressions.
You want to answer the tax question, Matt? I would say you expect your hit in 2025, because that's when all of the individual tax breaks in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are repealed or sunset.
So we've got 4 years, give or take, to get some tax relief for RBT. Cool.
That's somewhat in jest. Oh no, it wouldn't be tax relief. They would be going back up, because they were only repealed for 5 years. But I would say that in all seriousness, the time to get most nervous about taxes potentially going up would be in the context of infrastructure legislation. We saw that COVID response negotiations have been stalled since the midsummer on a debate that's largely along political lines, but not entirely, about the sheer amount of federal spending this year. And if that continues to be an issue and a stumbling block to getting some of a big economic stimulus or recovery package, or even an infrastructure bill across the line, you could certainly see, I think, a discussion about corporate rate or some other not insignificant tax changes to try to offset some of this revenue. I don't think that's going to be very easy. As I think that's one of the reasons it's been infrastructure week for, going on 225 weeks, but it's certainly, I think, where tax discussion is most likely to come up, because I don't see appetite to do a freestanding tax bill in a divided House and Senate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the freestanding tax bill scenario would have, quite frankly, been very realistic had Democrats captured the Senate and held the House by a higher margin. But we talked a little bit about executive orders earlier. Taxes are very hard to do by executive order. You really need Congress to go along with tax policy changes. So that's not
unless you're trading Bitcoins. Then...
Yeah, exactly. It's not real money anyway. So I think when, no offense to anybody who's invested in BTC right now, your investment's doing very well. But no, I think when you're looking at when you're looking at tax policy, I agree with Chris. I think one of the other things just on the horizon, since we're always looking ahead, is Democrats have the opportunity to capture the Senate in 2022. They have a very favorable map then. And the big battle there is going to be, how does Biden fare in his first midterm? Typically, presidents don't do well in their first midterm. Typically, the other party gains seats. But it will be a hard map for Republicans to hold in the Senate with a thin margin. And in the House, it will be a more favorable battle perhaps for Republicans, especially if they have some headwinds or some tailwinds pushing them forward. But I think I think 2022 could be very interesting and consequential when it comes to tax policy. But I agree, outside of a change in the composition of Congress, we're going to be more focused on what are the pay-fors, what are the offsets that they're using taxes to pay for something else that's popular. I think we could actually see, if we see any tax policy changes, we could actually see some tax cuts that are the type of tax cuts favored by Democrats. Chris can talk a little bit more about that, but I think if anything, I don't think we'll
Child
see
tax
taxes go
credit,
up.
extension of a number of those individual credits and cuts that were in TCJA. I think expansion of the earned income tax credit, modification of a number of other provisions that are down there. There's already concern, right, presently in the context of COVID response discussions about whether the earned income tax credit will essentially fail in a year where you've had such high unemployment for low wage earners, because if the benchmark for that EITC is calculated off of your 2020 earnings, then and they're significantly different and lower than your 2019 earnings, then
Two more pivot.
I see on the question, somebody asked about funding for the wall, the border wall in Mexico. It is an issue that's been in the news recently, not only the cost per mile, but also there is, I believe, $2 billion worth of funding in the appropriations process that they're looking at. And that's something that I wouldn't expect Democrats to be very enthusiastic about funding any further border wall. The only thing I would say is that Biden is a deal maker, and he's been in Congress, he's been in the Senate for a long time. He knows how to make a deal. And one thing that he has said he wants to do in his first 100 days is focus on immigration. So you never say never. And maybe
that focus will not be finishing the wall, man.
Yeah, no, but maybe the debate takes us in an interesting place if Biden does want Congress to do something on immigration and feels like there's a deal to be had. Maybe he does give on something that Republicans want on immigration, whether it's increased enforcement on some aspect of that. It will, but I agree with Chris, it won't be a wall.
Okay, a couple other quick lightning rounds. I have some other notes. Any comment on Iran?
I've seen a lot of interesting comments, especially with a lot of the Obama-Biden era national security advisors and folks coming back into the fold. I've seen a lot of comments, and I would portray them as probably people that are interested in influencing some of the decision making and some of the narrative around some of the early actions of the Biden administration. But one thing that I've seen a lot of is, people, not necessarily just conservatives, but some people saying, don't just go right back into the JCPOA the way it was before. And perhaps saying, we know you're taking a completely different approach on Iran than the Trump administration did. But, maybe there are some lessons to be learned about how JCPOA was and how it worked, and some of the upfront benefits to Iran from that deal. So I'm not prepared to say one way or the other exactly what the Iran policy is going to look like, but I have seen that from some people that I think would have some credibility with some of the folks in Biden world.
Great. So as we wrap up, here's a challenge for both of you, and you're good at this. What are the up to three buzzwords we should look for in the first 24 hours to 7 days of the Biden administration? Will it be a Trump unraveling? Will it be a landmark deal? What do you feel will be the 1, 2, or 3 key buzzwords we'll see?
Pardons. Not by President Biden.
Yeah. I like Chris's answer. I like your style, Chris. I think virtual.
I want to coin
I
this
think
term right now.
virtual because
Yeah.
the inauguration will be virtual. 80% of it will be at least.
Crush
So
the virus.
I think we'll see the word virtual a lot, and vaccine. I mean, I think vaccine is going to be such a critical part of Q1 of 2021. In part because, you know, a lot of obviously Operation Warp Speed started under President Trump. But when you look at where we're going to be in terms of the height of delivery and everything happening in 2021 and the doses that do or don't get to Americans in those first 90 days and some of the challenges, obviously, with storage and delivery and distribution, vaccines.
I would say Defense Production Act and emergency will also be high on the list of things that people are talking about.
We're building a word cloud.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do is build.
Oh, I wanted to coin a term. We're gonna call it the pardon chute. So it's like a parachute. You get it on as you jump out of the plane or jump out of the office.
Well, you jump out of something with that pardon chute and tell me how it turns out.
Well, truly, guys, first of all, thanks for staying up well past midnight. Ladies and gentlemen, these gentlemen put in a full day of work and came online for us, still in the middle of the night for us. So on behalf of the members.
Matt still has a commute home. I'm just
bless you. Well, thank you very much for taking time away from your families and time away from your personal time to connect with us here at AmChams Abu Dhabi, Israel, and in Bahrain. And we wish you a safe and a healthy holiday season. We hope that you have plenty of toilet paper and vaccine and PPE. And on behalf of everyone here at AmChams, we really thank you, Laura, Chris, and Matt, for your wonderful insights. And
well, I was just going to conclude by thanking you, Liz, and Laura for all that you guys do. Matt and I just come in for these things, and
we pardon shoot in.
Yeah.
I echo that. Thank you, Liz and Laura, for organizing this. And I see Zahir is on, but I was looking for Jason too, because I have some fantastic water here.
Awesome. That's awesome.
If Jason was on, he'd be all over the comments here. I don't think he's on.
He'd be going crazy, but I'm sure he'll watch it on the replay. And so everyone online, this will come.
The best water out there.
Awesome.
Fully endorsed, 10 out of 10.
The YouTube channel and everything will be sent to y'all shortly. We'll make sure you get it, Chris and Matt, your YouTube stars. And on behalf of everyone at AmChams Abu Dhabi, again, stay safe. We'll see you in the new era of whichever president it is. And I hope I don't need to pardon shoot my way out of that one. On that note, everyone, have a blessed day. Go home, Matt. And thanks, Chris, and Matt for everything.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.